Boker Tov, Tzoraim Tovim, and Erev Tov, as we have people joining us from all over the world. My name is Nomi Colton-Max, and I'm the Vice President of Programming at the American Zionist Movement. And the American Zionist Movement is one of the co-sponsors of this program. The AZM is comprised of 42 national Jewish Zionist organizations and works across a broad ideological, political, and religious spectrum, linking the American Jewish community together in support of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. We're delighted to welcome you today to What Would Ben Yehuda Say About Hebrew today? Would he approve of the Hebrew he hears in the streets of Haifa or Tel Aviv? Has it modernized and adapted as all languages do in the way that he expected? Did he think that other language would be incorporated into Hebrew slang? I really cannot wait for this discussion. Rabbi Andrew Ergas is our moderator today. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Hebrew at the Center, our other event co-sponsor. HATC engages institutions and professionals worldwide with the goal of advancing excellence in Hebrew teaching and learning. Its vision is a world where Hebrew is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to the thriving Jewish identity and the global Jewish community. Andrew brings 30 years of involvement in Jewish education and leadership to this position. He has held leadership positions at the Shames JCC on the Hudson, the Jewish Community Project downtown, Beit Rabban Day School on the Upper West Side. He's also served as executive director of ARTSA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America, an AZM organization, as well as positions in youth leadership for the Reform Movement, Young Judea, and JCCs, both in the United States and in Israel. Rabbi Ergas is ordained in Jerusalem by HUC-JIR, and he also holds master's degrees in nonprofit management and Hebrew literature, and is a doctoral candidate at the Davidson School with a research focus on Hebrew pedagogy and identity. Dr. Jewry Benstein is the author of Hebrew Roots, Jewish Roots, a Tribal Language in a Global World, a labor of love for and about the Hebrew language and its role in Jewish history, identity, and peoplehood. He's a member of 929, an Israeli project devoted to creative and inclusive, pluralistic Jewish discussion around the Bible as a central foundational cultural text. He's also the editor of the website 929 English and is a senior consultant at HATC. Jewry holds a BA in Linguistics from Harvard, an MA in Judaic Studies, and a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Hebrew University. He lives in Zichron Yaakov and is married to Dr. Annabelle Herzog, and together they continue to work on issues strengthening Israel and the society. Dr. Rina Kreitman is a lecturer of linguistics at the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. Prior to her current role, she served as a research associate and second language acquisition specialist at the National Foreign Language Center at the University of Maryland. Before working in the field of language acquisition, she directed the Hebrew program at Emory, which also lectured in faculty Judaic studies and linguistics. She's held similar positions at Columbia and the University College in London, and has published works on modern Hebrew linguistics and pedagogy in books and journals presented at numerous conferences. She's a native heritage speaker in Hebrew, English, and Russian, and also has additional skills in French, Spanish, and Italian. A graduate of Tel Aviv University of Linguistics, Rina earned her master's and doctoral at Cornell, where her dissertation focused on Hebrew phonetics and phonology. She continues to explore applied linguistics, language acquisition, and pedagogy of Hebrew and heritage learners. And last, but definitely not least, we have Michal Shomer, the creator and designer of multi-gender Hebrew, creating a new space in the Hebrew language. She has a bachelor's degree in visual communication design from the Cholon Institute of Technology. After publishing a free digital version of multi-gender Hebrew, a new set of all-inclusive Hebrew letters, which Michal will shortly discuss, she continues to develop her groundbreaking type and gives lectures promoting gender equality. Andrew is going to lead a discussion with our panelists here, and if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will get to them during or at the end of this session today. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Nomi, thank you so much, and a huge thanks to our friends and colleagues at the American Zionist Movement. You're wonderful partners when it comes to bringing new ideas to the broader community and to create platforms for discussion about things that are important to us. And obviously, Hebrew is at the center of Hebrew at the Center. It's, of course, also a pleasure to join such a group of compelling and interesting and bright panelists to engage in a structured conversation. surfacing some of the questions you yourself asked Naomi. And that is, of course, 100 years later, what the hell would Eliezer Ben Yehuda think about what's going on with this language that he played such a fundamental role in advancing from where it was to where it is? I do want to note, we hone in on his singular contribution to this process, but the returning of Hebrew to the Jewish people and the Jewish people to Hebrew certainly predates Eliezer Ben Yehuda. And this was a fairly robust activity that was taking place throughout the diaspora community, as the Jewish community was being influenced by other forms of nationalism, other forms of developing strong cultural articulations of who we were and what we were about. It was really mostly around writing and reading, but it certainly predates by a number of generations Eliezer Ben Yehuda's singular work. We also know that he is what we would call in Hebrew a mishugal ledavar, individual potentially literally crazy about this idea, and his own personal experimentation on what it would be like to create the first Hebrew-speaking home in the Jewish community after almost 2,000 years, and who singularly began to construct a modern framing and format for the Hebrew language that would make it functional in the 19th and 20th century. We know that he attracted others to that endeavor, eventually establishing Vada Lashon, a language committee, that today lives on in the Academy of the Hebrew language. And I think the thing that I'm really interested in exploring with Jeremy and with Rina and Michal is sort of, where did he envision this would all go? And then where did it go on its very own? Because as we know, languages are not a set thing. Languages are quite dynamic, and we'll be interested in sort of seeing what were some of the influencing forces that brought change to this letter. So what I'd love to do is just kind of open up with some broad discussion with Jeremy and with Rina and with Michal, and kind of get their reactions. When you think about Eliezer Ben Yehuda, if you can imagine what he was envisioning and dreaming just a little over 100 years ago, what do you think he would be extremely proud of 100 years later, and what would shock him? What would he would say, I could have never imagined this, either something that is positive or something that he would be less excited about? We'd love to take a swing at that first big question.
I'll start. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this. I think it's a great question. And for me, I live here in Israel, in Zichron Yaakov, and it's a great break from the rest of reality here in this country, where the most important Hebrew word, it seems, is demokratia. So Eliezer Ben Yehuda, I've asked myself many times, like that question, WWEBYS, right? Like, what would Eliezer Ben Yehuda say or do about what's going on now? While he did have the reputation of being a purist, right? That in those early years of regenerating a vernacular language, it was important to go back to Hebrew roots, and if not Hebrew, then Arabic roots, staying within the Semitic family, rather than taking the easy way out and just borrowing from what's known as Loazi, all those other languages. I think that now, 100 years after his death, I think he might have loosened up a little bit. That clear that Hebrew is well entrenched and well established as a native vernacular language for the people of the country, and it can then harness all the creative forces of what all living languages do, which is grow and change and incorporate all kinds of influences, foreign and otherwise. And so I think that he'd be, first of all, he'd be happy to see that Israel is a thriving sovereign country, because the whole idea of the revernacularization of the Hebrew language was to be as part of a sovereign state, right? The national project here. I think he'd probably get a kick out of Hebrew rap and hip hop as part of something that's the living language and sensitive to the internal rhythms and music of the language. He might be a little annoyed, like many of the rest of us, about just how much English is part of Hebrew, but maybe he'd be happy about how much Arabic is part of Hebrew, Arabic slang and other things. And I wonder if he would have questions about, not so much the linguistic questions, but the more social political ones about the relations between secular and religious in this country. He himself experienced a lot of tensions and criticism from the old Yishuv and the religious powers that be of his time. So that's what I would say.
Jeremy, thank you. Rina, your thoughts as somebody who also came from the more academic environment, when you're sort of observing what's going on in the language, what would make him excited? What might frustrate him?
I think I second Jeremy. I think that he would just be excited about the language being alive and the fact that we are using, to all intents and purposes, as we all know, about 66% of our vocabulary is biblical. So he did give us a lot of that. And like Jeremy, I think what would shock him is the number of borrowed words from non-Semitic languages, be it English or French or any other contributor to the language. And if I look at it from a phonetic point of view, the several sounds that have come in that are not supposed to be natively Hebrew, but are well entrenched in our language, like ja and ja and cha.
Michal, you get a reaction on this big question as well.
Well, I can't really speak to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, but if I were him, I would be pleased with how Hebrew evolved and developed, and I would be amazed by the fact that there are millions of people using Hebrew every day, and not only using, but this is their first and sometimes their only language. So this is just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and I do want I want to note that perhaps using the term mishuga was a misplaced term. Certainly, we would say we're mishugat l'davar, that we're crazy about this. Probably we would say that a more accurate term was really a level of zealousness that Eliezer brought to this term that Jeremy used, this revernacularization, that is, taking a language that had been used primarily for sacred purposes over 2 millennia and had to re-enter into day-to-day secular use. And I'm would love to learn a little more. I know we have a couple people on this in this conversing group with a strong background in linguistics. How, what really is at play that causes some words to catch, that get created by whether it was Eliezer Ben Yehuda or by the Academy, and other words that for some reason don't catch and get replaced by or used by loan words from other languages, whether it's loan words from English or loan words from Arabic or any other sort of language community that Hebrew comes in contact with. Like what's really happening there?
Rina, do you have a good answer for that?
So I think the answer is multi-layered, and there's a host of factors that go into whether a word will survive or not. Some of them may be phonological. So does it sound good? Does it sound like something I want to say? Some of it could also be sociological, sociolinguistic. So sociolinguistic considerations may play a role in it. Does this word sound cool? Do I sound more cool saying caseta or caletet? What sounds more? So that would be something that plays into it. Politics, the sociopolitical climate could also play a role in this. And also, funny enough, so for me, a word that was invented, which we'll come back to, chamarmoet, that's never quite caught on and remained as hangover forever and ever, even though it's come out. And I think that there's a few things that are at play here. First of all, it's not transparent enough. So the meaning of chamarmoret, as Israelis, it's opaque for us where it comes from. So it's hard for us to connect it to being hungover. So that's number one. Number two, it reminds us of other words like chamor that have nothing to do with hangover. So there's a whole host of factors at play that will determine whether a word will survive or not. But the Academy certainly tries.
Yeah, I think you touched on all the major things that I would have. Certainly the mellifluousness of the word, if it sounds good to our ears. And just to expand a little bit about that sociolinguistic, social context side of it, I recently spoke on a UNESCO panel about the global significance of Hebrew becoming a spoken language. What can other languages, other struggling languages, can learn about it from our example? And I said that one of the big difficulties in exporting our little miracle here to other languages is that Hebrew, fairly uniquely, was revived by a few central older figures like Ben Yehuda and others in Jerusalem and other places at that time, but it really caught on because of the youth. I mean, the young people who made Aliyah in the first and second Aliyot and were transforming their lives, it wasn't a big deal to transform their whole language if they already moved halfway around the world and became farmers and everything else. And most of the struggling languages today are trying to be revived by the older generation who are dying out, the native speakers, and want to try to pass that on to the young who are victims of globalization and everything else. So part of that social side is just what kind of word it is and who it's being marketed to be the agents of introducing that word into society. Sometimes words can be created and diffused in society from the top down. I think the academia, right, the Hebrew Language Academy they haven't given up on that mission in life to come up with new words, but I think that they've demonstrated much more a willingness and being much more attuned to what's going on in society, and often will crowdsource a new word, like with an official competition, or sort of like the way a good landscape architect would plan a path in a park. Let's see where the people walk, and then we'll pave it, rather than trying to force a path through and then see if people actually do that or use a shortcut. So I think that more things are just bubbling up from the bottom and then getting an official imprimatur, as it were, from the academia.
Jeremy, if I can also chime in and extend what you were saying in terms of the conditions that existed in Israel, a lot of the times it was a melting pot and the people didn't have a common language. So the fact that Hebrew had to function as a lingua franca definitely propelled it to a higher stand in the community, whereas many of the languages that are trying to be revived today, most of the people have an additional language to fall on, which they find easier to communicate in. So that definitely acts as a block that prevents these languages from being able to be revived.
I'd love to pick up on something that both of you surfaced and turn to Michal and ask a different question. you indicated sort of the contextual influencers on language, and certainly some of them are changes in sort of demography and sociolinguistics and culture, history, politics, et cetera. I'd probably also throw out there from time to time, there are words that we don't actually, that are there are concepts that are not necessarily native to Jewish life or to Judaism, and sometimes we have to borrow the concept to bring it in, and therefore sometimes give it a name that doesn't begin with a three-letter root, like as you said earlier, Jeremy, a demokratia. But we know that there were a number of things that were not a part of Eliezer Ben Yehuda or his peers' consciousness, including the idea that there wasn't just a singular community that was sort of normative, but that there were many different communities who brought to the table different perspectives. And I know in particular, gender was probably not high on the agenda at that time, even if they were wrestling with the gender, a language that had been and is often seen as a gendered language. And I know that was something that Michal sort of addressed. And Michal, I'd love if you could give us just a few thoughts on what led you to this extraordinary work that you did, and then give us a bit of an example, then we can kind of react to what does this look like as a sample of that changing and dynamic phenomena.
Yeah, that's a very interesting discussion, and yeah, I'll be happy to share the work that I'm doing or trying to do to make Hebrew more inclusive to all genders. So just as some background, I'm sure most of you know that Hebrew, so every word in Hebrew is either masculine or feminine. And in Hebrew, the masculine form is considered the generic form. But many women in Israel and many people that are outside of gender binaries don't feel that this generic form includes them or represent them. And in fact, research show that using the masculine generic form has a negative impact on girls and women and their chance to succeed in modern society. So in an attempt to address these challenges in the Hebrew language, I developed multi-gender Hebrew. I'm a visual communication designer, so I'm going to use some visuals. So let me share my screen to show you some examples. So multi-gender Hebrew has two main goals. One goal is to acknowledge women's presence in the Hebrew language and include women in the conversation. And another goal is to form an all-inclusive linguistic space for non-binary people. So what is multi-gender Hebrew? Multi-gender Hebrew is a new set of Hebrew letters that I designed that are added to the Hebrew alphabet and facilitate multi-gender and inclusive reading and writing. So you can see on the screen the phrase with multi-gender Hebrew letters, the phrase says, all people are equal. If it was written with the standard Hebrew letters, it would probably be Kol ha'anashim shavim or Kol ha'nashim shavot, which is all men are equal or all women are equal. But when using the new letters, it's all people are equal. And let me show you some more examples. So we have the phrase welcome in Hebrew, two words, Bruchim habaim or Bruchot habaot. You can see in red highlights the differences between the masculine and the feminine forms. And this is how it looks like with the new multi-gender letters that I designed. I also gave names to each letter. So we have Yuv and Tem Sofit over here. Some more example, the sentence, I love her or I love him. With the new multi-gender Hebrew letters, it can be I love them in the singular form. And another example of one of my favorite multi-gender letters, the letter final nem. This sentence says, well done, everyone. So with multi-gender Hebrew, it's really everyone, not only men or only women. And I designed a total of 11 new letters and 1 Nikud sign. So it's a total of 12 new characters. And there's a Facebook page to Multigender Hebrew. And I think about 2 years ago or so, I published free files for download with the sentence welcome in Multigender Hebrew. And since then, so many people and institutions are using this phrase in signage and in public spaces. So there are signs here from the Negev, Machon LeMoreshet Ben Gurion, from Haifa, the Technion in Haifa. In the bottom right side, there is a photo from the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. It was put up in the room in the room of the Committee of Gender Equality. There are a lot of schools in Israel that are using this signage. At the bottom here, at the center, this is a photo from my elementary school. So this is pretty exciting. And after publishing just this phrase of welcome to download, I also published a free version of all the new multigender letters that you can download, and you can download them with a keyboard. So you can type on your computer with the new letters. And here again, some examples. People are downloading and using the new letters, writing text with the new letters. There is on the bottom right side, this is a poem that was printed on coasters, and Rishon LeZion municipality gave them out in bars all over the city to support the LGBTQ plus community. There is ads that are calling for new employees. You can see 7-Eleven on the bottom right side calling for new employees with multigender Hebrew. There are tattoos with multigender Hebrew, a wedding invitation. And there was also a writing contest about a year and a half ago or so, where all works had to be submitted using the new letters. And you can see here the winning poem of Tamar Lazar, which I think did a very smart and clever work with using the new letters in terms of how they might sound, because multigender Hebrew is only for the written language, so I didn't develop a new way to pronounce the new letters. But for the written language, it allows you to read the text in a multigender way. And also I wanted to point out, if you're not fluent in Hebrew, there was recently a New York Times article about all the changes in the Hebrew language, and I was also interviewed there, and they mentioned multigender Hebrew. And this is really fascinating because this discussion about gender and language, it's actually relevant for languages around the world, and not only Hebrew. So this is very it's a hot topic and an important issue, and I invite you all to visit the website and download and play with the new type. So this is just one of my attempts to have the language more inclusive, especially in Hebrew.
So Michal, I'm first of all a huge fan of this work that you've done. We at Hebrew at the Center have a lot of activity that goes on in various Jewish educational spaces, including in summer camps, and we have a large poster with many different ways that people have found their way into the Hebrew community, including we have the presentation of your new alphabet. There are some people are wondering, are there any, do you have a sense, or how do you pronounce some of these new letters that you've created?
Oh, so that's a good question. I think that I either use both the feminine and masculine forms when I speak, or I choose based on the context. So a lot of time, like I give out lectures, and I show a text that is talking about teachers, and I ask people to read it out loud. And often I see that they choose to use the feminine form, and I think that I think that maybe one of the reasons is that there are actually 90% women teachers in Israel. We usually hear in Hebrew, we usually hear like Irgun Hamorim, Histadrut Hamorim, always in the masculine form, but actually the majority, I mean, almost everyone are women. So I think that it's interesting to when you think about gender, or when the text gives you an opportunity to think of the content in this perspective of gender, you can start to get a better idea on what happens inside in the society, or what are some of the challenges that each gender face, and it gives you more room for thought.
Thank you. I mean, I'd love to expand just a little. I know I was at the Icon gathering in Chicago last week and had the opportunity to sit in a session with Lior, who has created Aravrit, which is not really new. It's 600 plus new letters that allow both a Hebrew word and an Arabic word to be put together, so that a Hebrew reader and an Arabic reader would read a common word rather than two different. So there's a lot of interesting things that are at play. I'd love to hear, from Jeremy, from Rina, not only your reaction to the work that Michal and others are doing in those spaces, but what are the other demographic phenomena or political phenomena that are starting to create additional upheaval in modern Hebrew today, 100 years after Eliezer Ben Yehuda?
First of all, I just want to say how impressive I think that work is. I think it's like socially and politically really astute and necessary, and aesthetically it's really attractive. It's fantastic for signs. For extended selections of text, it takes practice, speaking from personal experience, to be able to read it fluidly. And indeed, it raises the question. I
can assure you that practice works. So.
It definitely raises the question of how to take that next step into the spoken language. How do we say it? And so I mean a number of contexts where people will now address like a group of people, like chaverimot or something like that, to include the masculine and the feminine. You say that one of the explicit goals is to also be inclusive of non-binary people, and I'd be curious to hear. And that was a question I see in the Q&A here about whether it really fulfills that goal, because it still is just combining male and female, right? So this question was raised just a few days ago. I was talking with a friend in the States who's actually, she had written a book about the Jewish holidays, and she was asked to update it and revise it. And she was thinking about how to include non-binary terms. And so in writing about Simchat Torah, of course, one of the honors that are given in Simchat Torah is to be like the Chatan Torah. So that obviously is easily expanded into Kalat Torah if you have a female honoree. But then the question is, well, what if it is indeed non-binary, right? So how would you, what would be the new concept or a different way of languaging that development?
I think we have more work to be done. Maybe we have some specific terms or unique terms that we'll have to come up with a new word for them, like Chatan Kala. It's not just adding a letter or removing a letter. So that, for me, that gives room for creativity. I see it as a great opportunity to, come up with more and more solutions and words and techniques. And it's actually a fun part. And about the first part of your question, so I think that even though there is, when you speak, you have to choose maybe how to say the word in the masculine or feminine form, but when you read it, I also got some feedback from non-binary community in Israel that multigender Hebrew does serve this purpose of being inclusive or non-binary, because you don't really have to choose when you write or when you read the text like to yourself. It gives you the place for all gender, for the entire gender spectrum. So yeah.
I'm curious, Rina, not only your thoughts and reactions, but are there other things that you see emerging up into coming into the language from the broader society that's trying to figure out its home in this language?
So the question is if you're asking a linguistic question or a politically motivated question. So linguistically, you can give it a very completely unrelated to this discussion, things like how do we name new objects, new things that come out, computer language. So we have to make up words for that. New diseases, COVID, is it going to be COVID, Corona? So that's one aspect of the language, just regular words for new words that are coming up. But I think the issue of this gender in language is a political issue rather than a linguistic issue. And I think the solution of it is also going to be political rather than linguistic.
If you had to, just one question, Michal. Rina, if you had to anticipate where this is going, in particular, if there's uncertainty about how the language actually gets used as a spoken language, what's going to push it in a in a forward direction, and what is going to perhaps preclude it from becoming more normative?
Michal, did you want to say something?
Oh, no. I just about what you said before, I thought that even though it might be a political discussion or decision or, conclusion, but I think that the linguistic aspect can provide a wide range of possibilities. So it could be a linguistics perspective or a design perspective or whatever, but we might get more and more options to choose from based on maybe a political
So the way this is working is that you're looking to make changes top down. So that means that there are certain political pressures that are putting pressures on the language, and you are trying to change the language top down. And language change that's organic takes place bottom up. And I don't see this bottom up happening. And part of it has to do with the fact that we are very, very focused on gender issue in people. But the fact is that the language is gendered regardless of people. So what do you do with things like shulchan, shulchanot? Are you now going to say shulchan, shulchanim? So what you're expecting people, so the point is that the language is gendered. So unless you go through a degendering process, which happened in English, so English used to have genders, now it doesn't have genders anymore. So words, nouns had gender. But the fact that we assign a political importance or significance to this gender can't apply to nouns that are completely apolitical. They don't have anything to, so the language is going to remain gendered. And when people are speaking in fast speech and they're not thinking about being politically correct, they're just going to seek the shortest way to express themselves. And anytime you try to add complication to communication, then this complication needs to be resolved. It needs to be simplified for the speakers, because speakers are by design lazy. And that's why we look for shortcuts. And these shortcuts are found everywhere, from sounds. How do we make sounds go faster? So you don't say I'm going to, I'm gonna, I wanna. Everything gets smaller and smaller on every level. So if you're going to add complications at various levels, people are going to resolve them and simplify them. How? That will depend on the politics of what will be dictated. So if anybody that says the wrong word will be fired, guess what? everybody will be saying the right thing. If we are more tolerant and decide, okay, I say masculine, I say feminine, and everyone's equal, I don't care, and they're just used interchangeably, then that will be your solution. If your solution will be, okay, we're going to a conservative government and nobody's allowed to use, then that will be the solution. But I don't think that this will be organically dictated to speakers.
So it's very, if I
Please,
can
Michal.
comment, maybe, yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying. The way I see it, I look at this as steps along the way. I don't see multigender Hebrew as a final step for anything, or none of the other options that we have to use gender in a more inclusive way. I don't think any of them is the end. So I think that we're moving and developing, and maybe one technique will make us find another one, and will evolve slowly. And I really agree that language works, bottom up, and it's not like you can force someone to say something or a lot of people to say something. But I think that actually with multigender Hebrew, the amazing thing is that I created an option, a method, but people are using it bottom up. I mean, I didn't tell anyone you have to use that and not this, but people are just using it more and more. And if we have the technology to allow this method or other methods to be widespread, then people might use it more and more and more.
So I'm still a bit in shock. As somebody who was trained as a rabbi, the idea that people would want the shortest way to say something makes no sense to me. But if you say that's true as a linguist, Rina, I'll accept it. We've certainly heard a lot about the influence of English and other global languages. We've just had, I think, a rich and focused conversation about gender and how that's playing itself out. I am curious. In many ways, the founding of the state was led not exclusively but extensively by the community coming from Western and Central and Eastern Europe, and it was very sort of Eshka normative. I'd be curious, what has been the influence of not only the influx of Jews who came from countries where they spoke other languages, in particular Middle Eastern languages, and the fact that there's a meaningful population of Hebrew speakers in the state of Israel whose primary language at home is Arabic. How's that impacting what's going on in this language that Eliezer Ben Yehuda launched? Or do we not see any influence of Arabic in day-to-day Hebrew or any of the other communities that brought new languages, in the last 25 to 30 years? There's been a huge influx of Russian speakers. There's been an influx of Amharic speakers. Are any of those influencing contemporary Hebrew?
Good questions. Sometimes there are good questions where we have good answers to, and sometimes good questions where I don't entirely know. I'm not aware of the sociological studies on that. From my personal experience, I don't think that Amharic and Russian have really made inroads into spoken Israeli Hebrew. Despite the fact that there indeed a huge influx, just numerically, of Russian speakers, I think Arabic and Hebrew is a different story, and it's coming obviously not only from those Jews whose native language is Arabic or was Arabic. I think there are fewer and fewer households where that is true, where the spoken language at home is Arabic. Of course, that population has suffered from its inception as being considered far less prestigious dialect, as you would say, in terms of, as you say, the Ashka normative tendencies in Israeli society. And I think that's only been changing recently with the rise of, really self-conscious Mizrahi cultural creatives, whether it be in poetry, where there's a big movement, as well as in other music and arts, the growing centrality of what's called Musika Mizrachit and the mainstreaming of that. It used to be really a very fringe or niche kind of artistic form, and now it's really a very mainstream. So previously the typical Mizrahi accent, right, what was called speaking with het the ayin, was seen as really, coarse and uneducated. And while I don't know if it's grown in prevalence, it's certainly, I don't think it's seen nearly that way anymore. And that's all just from the Jews from Arab countries. And of course, the interaction with Palestinians in Israel, and the fact that Arabic is one of the spoken languages, recognized spoken languages in Israel, as well as something that's important in terms of our integration into this social space in the Middle East, I think has given it a certain amount of traction and attraction, but it's far from being, I think, a huge influence on just normative spoken Hebrew.
Great. We would love to continue the conversation, but also bring in some of the questions that are being surfaced from the participants in this wonderful webinar. I actually would love to turn to our first questioner, representing actually one of the member organizations of the American Zionist Movement. We're going to get that first question from Erica Kirshner. They are the musky role of Habonim Dror, and that musky role is another example of making changes to Hebrew to fit how we see the world today. And that's a non-gendered Hebrew term that was developed for the national leaders. So we're going to turn to Eric and ask you to share your question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica. I am the musculo, as was introduced. And I had a question. I wanted to know about your thoughts on Hebrew language changes in the diaspora. So, for example, in my movement, Habonim Dror North America, in 2015, one of our movement members brought a proposal about non-gendered Hebrew. And so the way in the movement that we talk is for like words that refer to people, we add im ot onto the end if it's plural. And for a singular, if someone opts to use a non-binary term, we have the ending ol coming from the word kol or all. So for example, instead of just being a madrich or a madricha, you can be a madrichol. And then the plural would obviously be madrichimot. And we've been doing this now for about 8 years. And it's really integrated into the way we speak, Hebrew at our machanot and in the movement in general. And so I'm curious to know what you think changes like this, or I've heard about other people in the diaspora who have various ways that they've been trying to do non-gendered Hebrew, how you see that having an impact on what Hebrew will end up looking like in Israel.
Erica, thank you for a great question. Michal, looks like you turned off your mute, as did Jeremy, as did Rina. Let's go for it.
I don't really have an answer, but I think the more the merrier. I mean, I'm really happy that there is a variety of options, and I hope that everyone that speaks Hebrew or wants to speak Hebrew can feel included and at home with Hebrew. So I think this is a very interesting and great initiative or ideas, or
I completely agree. I saw that term "multicultural" for the first time in the preparation for this webinar, and I think it's a great idea. I want to turn a question back to you, Erica. You have counterparts here in Israel, whether it's Dror or Nor HaLomed, whatever the parallel movements are. What do they say about it? And have they taken your lead and adopted similar innovations?
What I understand, I don't think the ol ending as a singular ending has caught on so much. I do know that there are some people who use the emote ending for plural. And then I think what tends to happen is that people default to the feminine ending often instead of just the masculine ending, even when it's sometimes plural. What's interesting to me about like our like little innovation, I guess you could say, is the person who brought it, they didn't really intend it to be like the be all to end all, here's how non-binary Hebrew singular should work, but their inspiration was really, there wasn't anything that we could use, and they thought like, let's create something for now. And if it sticks and ends up being what works later, that's amazing. And if not, like something will happen eventually and our movement will switch to that if it feels better, or is what's being actually widely used by our partners in Israel and by Israeli society as a whole, obviously.
I think it's fascinating that innovation like this is actually happening more in the diaspora than really inside Israel. I mean, there are other developments along that score as well, like the idea of changing the vowels to be non-gendered, like instead of having to choose between tov and tova for good, you would say toveh. And this coming out of, again, speakers from places in the United States. And on the one hand, I'm a little pessimistic that it's actually going to spread here in Israel, but I think it's a great way for a diaspora speakers of Hebrew or people using Hebrew in various contexts to make it their own and to be creative in the language. And I think we've said several times, who knows what's going to stick? I mean, there were attempts in English to create a non-gendered pronoun, ZE, right? Which I don't think has caught on, but other things have caught on. So you just have to like kind of, maybe it's just we have to like, the generation in the desert have to wait for all of us boomers to die out. And then the next generations will speak a little bit better in that way.
Great. Erica, thank you so much for surfacing this question. There's a lot of discussion in the Q&A section. In particular, people want to understand how new words are formed, and in particular, is there a process which differentiates between transliteration, like televizia, versus creating building a multi-word or using a current shoresh that allows a new word to be created that people feel will not only be effective but also stick. Rina, do you have some? Can you share some of your thoughts on what a number of people have asked?
Right. So first of all, there's various ways in which words enter the language. One of them is direct borrowing. And what happens is once the Academy gets word of the new word, the Academy rolls up its sleeves and starts trying to come up with the Hebrew equivalent or something that would replace it. So in case that it sounds plausible or close enough to what would be a native Hebrew word, the Academy is happy to leave it alone. So for example, the word for meme is mem, because it sounds natively Hebrew, and the Academy purposely did not come up with any new words for meme. So meme is mem, literally. In other cases, when it sounds really quite foreign, then we have a process where we borrow a word, and then the Academy goes into the back rooms and tries to see how to come up with a new one. So a word like, for example, caseta, which is what we used to call those little things when I was growing up, that you used to listen to music on. They decided that it was going to be called kaletet. Now, how do we disperse this word and make people learn of our new words, other than the fact that we put out a newsletter every so often to tell about these new words? They also start incorporating them in subtitles in television shows. They also start including them in children's books and other media that is targeted towards children. And guess what? A generation later, children, well, I don't think they know what kaletet is, but they say kaletet and not kaseta anymore. Other words, like the word I mentioned before, chamarmoret. Chamarmoret is hangover. And why is that word about? Because, Jeremy, do you want to tell the etymology of that word?
Gosh, I didn't prepare on this. I know it's connected to the word
Right.
chamra for wine, but also
So,
me'ai chamar maru is a verse
right.
about yeah. But go
So
ahead.
it was the big jugs where they used to prepare the wine back in the day, but it also is mishkal machalot, like ademet, tzevet, chamarmoret. So so they took these two things and they combined them together, and they thought this was a great word. But that never caught on because it's not transparent to the speakers. Most speakers don't know why chema or chamra is related to wine, so they just don't adopt it. So yeah, so that's what happens to new words. Sometimes they come in organically, they're borrowed, and sometimes the Academy has more success in rerouting them and implanting their own word. Sometimes they leave it alone, sometimes just the way it is.
Sometimes slang words, right, from TV and stuff. Yeah,
So
I'm not an expert on that, but I was just thinking, about Eretz Nederet and all the words that they added to the language.
So television medium, that they make up words. However, those words are largely untouched by the Academy. So
just add a couple of things. First of all, really kudos to the Academy. They don't just put out their newsletters anymore. They're on Instagram, which in Hebrew we call Instush, and they make TikTok videos. And I mean, they're really trying to communicate to the people where they are. I'll just some words actually come in from one register of the language, like something might be accepted in more formal writing of Hebrew. Like they were questioning here about telephone, televizia, internet in the questions. So telephone, the idea of sach rachok, which means like to speak at a distance, never caught on anywhere. But occasionally you'll hear the word mirka, which is the sort of fancy Academy word for television, but only in fancy contexts. But I've heard more and more the word mirshetet, which is the, again, Academy invented word for internet, from reshet, from net, and that might be catching on. You need to do these Google searches for the frequency of these things in printed matter. I'll just mention just two things. Sometimes there are words that you don't realize are borrowed. I was surprised when I first read that the word mivreshet, which means brush in Hebrew, is from the root brush, bet reshin. So just literally taking an English language root and putting it into a Hebrew mishkal, a Hebrew form. And there's a much larger than you think family of words that are called tashmots, which means tirgum, shomer, mashmaut, v'tzlil. In other words, using a Hebrew word that could be from a valid Hebrew root, but it's to kind of mimic a foreign word. So even just the word glida, which means ice cream, and is from a root that goes back to the Middle Ages, geled, which we sometimes use for scab, so it's the idea of coagulation, not very appetizing, but they chose that because it's the same consonants or close to the same consonants as gelato and other European words for ice cream. And there's actually a pretty large family like that, so that's one way of things coming in. But but again, you know, whether they stick or not, I don't think anybody has like a real lock on that to saying, oh, let's use this word because this will definitely be accepted. You have to see what comes through.
But Jeremy, now that you say that, there's also translations of foreign words, like Tepuach Adama is literally pomme de terre from French. And they did the same for agvania and a whole bunch of Hebrew words, but that was by design. So even though that was old, it predates the academy, still the same sort of manner. We put our thinking cap on and think how we're going to invent these words that will come into the language.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Akvania, and we're talking about Eliezer Ben Yehuda, because if you're looking for drama in the language, there's some things that talk about the huge struggles and wars between the innovators of Hebrew words back in the day. So Eliezer Ben Yehuda wanted to use the word that's common in Arabic, which is bandora, which is actually similar to Tapuch Adama. It's palm d'or, golden apple, but in but that didn't catch on, and this other word agvania was suggested, and Bialik didn't like that because he hated this suffix iya for things. He didn't like Hanukiya or Sufganiya or those kinds of words, and plus that, I remember my grandmother, who was a Hebrew teacher in Brooklyn in like the 1920s. So I'm not even sure what kind of Hebrew she was teaching. I don't know how much spoken Hebrew was coming out of Israel at that time to New York in 100 years ago. But she was a little bit aghast at the idea of just a word for tomato that used the word, the root ayin gimel bet, which relates to lust. I mean, you talk about the disease form, right? Agevet is a venereal disease. So that agvania, because it was connected to aphrodisiacs and stuff. So there are a lot of interesting stories of words and the arguments back and forth about what should or shouldn't be accepted.
Jeremy, it was the
so I need to hop in as we start making our way towards the end of this session, though. Pleased, I'm certain the AZM will be pleased to know when everyone asks where they got the Hebrew word for venereal disease. They got it from the AZM webinar on 100 years after Eliezer Ben Yehuda. I would love to give you each kind of a final moment to kind of reflect on some of the different words that we surfaced and the processes that we surfaced and the challenges to the language. We can go back to the non-binary letters as just a wonderful example. As I understand, the Academy has actually formally approved that whoever is the majority gender, that can be the primary language that is used. We certainly see in the political environment and in the business environment, more and more often, you'll have both Bruchim Habaim and Bruchot Habaot, sort of the acknowledgement and recognition that there is, although still gendered, at least a diversity of people in front. What do you think Eliezer Ben Yehuda would think of all of this? And if you could anticipate maybe one other type of change we're going to see in the Hebrew language over the next 30 to 40 years, what might you expect it to be? So Michal, as you brought your wonderful work into the conversation, what do you think Eliezer Ben Yehuda would say? And what's coming next down the pipeline?
Well, I really can't say what he would say. I think that the fact that the language is changing is just an amazing thing, because a language that stops and doesn't adapt to the progress and the society might die. You have to keep it alive and you have to let it thrive and develop. So I keep saying these things because I really believe in them, and I hope that in terms of language and gender, I hope to see more and more options and methods and new words to use the language in a more inclusive way. Whether it's coming from the Hebrew Academy, which I'm not sure it will, because I think it's a need that is coming from the people, from the speakers, Hebrew speakers. So I hope to see more of that coming up from bottom up, as you said, Rina.
Thank you. Thank you, Rina. Your thoughts and any predictions?
Yeah, so Michal, I love your font, and I really liked Erica's solution that they proposed for this gender neutral. However, there are a lot of different solutions, and as opposed to Jeremy, who says throw all the past at the wall and see what sticks, I think that you would get more mileage out of uniting and being more centralized in terms of ideas and working together with the academy to come up with solutions that the academy can also distribute. So I think rather than opening a page and seeing, oh, here's an idea, here's 1,000 more ideas, which do I choose? If you centralize the ideas, I think there would be more mileage in coming closer to a solution that would please the greatest number of people rather than individuals working on their own. That's my 2 cents.
I think we're not there yet. I think we're still on the phase of looking out and expanding, but we might get there. I mean, yeah.
Great. Jeremy, your forecast.
As somebody once said, you know, it's really dangerous to try to make any predictions, especially about the future. First of all, one of the reasons why I moved to Israel specifically was to be in a Hebrew-speaking society, and I love being part of this this revolution in Jewish consciousness that's been going on for over 100 years. And one of the things I take greatest joy in is from my children. I have twin boys who are now in their mid-20s, studying at the Hebrew University, Università Ivrit, and I learn new things from them all the time. I have no idea where, you know, what new things we might see in terms of the language. I can agree a little bit with you, Rina, what you said about your recommendation. I just think it's a very sort of dynamic and synthetic process. So there's no reason why you can't do both, essentially. Like all kinds of diversification happens in the people, and we do have the academia, whose work I very much respect and appreciate, and they can at the same time work to try to concentrate and whatever. One of the differences between, I think, me, who has a background in linguistics, and the average sort of Hebrew teacher or Israeli kind of speaker who sometimes sniffs a little bit at all the foreign influences, etc., is that there are two approaches in linguistics. One is descriptive and one is prescriptive. And in Hebrew, we say ta'arani, from litaer, to describe, or taharani, from tahor, meaning pure. So they sound close, but they're very different. And I firmly believe in the descriptive approach, that linguists and other people involved in language creation should be tagging along behind the people, trying to figure out what they're actually doing, rather than trying to push themselves ahead and lead and tell them what to do. So I just may add with one anecdote, because you said, okay, going back to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, there's a great story about his daughter, Dola, who she lived to, I think, over 90. And towards the end of her life, she was informed that Eliezer Ben Yehuda's gravestone on Har HaZitim was defaced by, I think it was ultra-Orthodox, who were opposed to Hebrew being a spoken language and not still being Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. And she, you know, they expected her to be very distressed about this. And she said, well, what language did they write in when they defaced his tombstone? What, you know, when they wrote the curses, they said, well, they wrote in Hebrew. And she said, okay, well, we've won. So.
Jeremy, Thank you for that great anecdote. Also, Michal, Rina, thank you for your contributions. I too have a twin in his mid-20s, also at Hebrew University. He keeps me up to speed, so he sent me a Hebrew word a couple of weeks ago, hit gavra, to mansplain. It was wonderful, though, not to have mansplaining here, but really some wonderful, insightful thoughts about our language. And I use the word our language intentionally. I think one of the great successes of Eliezer Ben Yehuda and those that were a part of this initiative was that Hebrew has come back in full force as not only as a dynamic language, but as a language that others look to as the golden standard of how do you bring a language back to life. And, in our day and age, more than 50% of all Jewish kindergartners around the world now have Hebrew as their mother tongue or as their sfat em. But I certainly call on all of us to always remember it is also a sfat am. It's also the language of our people. So let's all move forward with our great efforts. And with that, I'd love to turn it back to Naomi Colton-Max to conclude our session.
Wow, this has been a tremendous 75 minutes. And I wish we could answer all of the questions, especially those that we got so many about the influence of Arabic and Yiddish and Ladino. Well, we always say we know it's a good session when there are lots more questions that still need to be answered, which means we will find ways to continue this discussion. I was told a few years ago that the verb was lefaspek when Facebook came out. I never believed it. I think I'm the only one still using it, but maybe someone will correct me at another point. But I love that, part of the shoresh and in that word, just like you talked about with other words. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Jewry Benstein, Dr. Rina Kreitman, and Michal Shomer, and of course, our moderator, Rabbi Andrew Ergas, and Hebrew at the Center for being our co-sponsor. This program has been recorded. We will post it on the AZM website when it is ready, and anyone who has registered for this program, you will also get a notice when this occurs. A shout out to Herbert Block, Alicia Post, and Ariana Typograph for their help this morning with this session from the AZM staff. Herbert Block is our executive director. Alicia Post is our programmer, and Ariana Typograph does all of our big Zooms, and we're so grateful for their help behind the scene. Toda rabba lekulam. I wish everyone a meaningful and delicious Pesach, and stay tuned for further events from all of us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.